Hi, my name is Natalie, and Brian, Jody, and I will be presenting on Guillain-Barré syndrome, or GBS for short. What is GBS? GBS is an autoimmune disease in which a person's own immune system attacks the outer coating sheath of the nerve fibers called myelin. About two-thirds of GBS cases have an antecedent infection within 6 weeks prior to symptom onset, generally an upper respiratory tract infection or gastroenteritis. Although the pathological organism is not often identified, the usual infectious agents associated with GBS include Epstein-Barr virus, Mycoplasma pneumoniae, Campylobacter jejuni, and cytomegalovirus. GBS was also found to develop after vaccination against simple rabies and some types of influenza A virus. The immune system produces an immune response to these infections, which cross-reacts with the nerves, damaging the myelin sheath. The disease can range from mild weakness to devastating paralysis. GBS consists of different subsets including acute inflammatory demyelinating polyradiculoneuropathy, which is the classic demyelinating form of GBS and accounts for 90% of all GBS cases in the Western world, and acute motor axonal neuropathy and acute motor and sensory axonal neuropathy. These are axonal forms of GBS that are more prevalent in Asia, South and Central America, and are often preceded by infections by Campylobacter jejuni. Men are 1.5 times more likely to be affected than women, and the incidence increases with age. Most patients recover when the disease reaches a low point at around 2 to 4 weeks, but 10 to 20% of patients are left with disabling motor deficits where changes in habits or job is needed if the deficits are detrimental enough. And 4 to 15% of patients die within 1 year of getting the disease. GBS requires different types of treatment. This includes general supportive treatment such as monitoring and controlling pulse rate, blood pressure, and vital capacity. Acute supportive treatment for urinary retention, bowel dysfunction, and pain. And immunotherapy including plasmapheresis and intravenous immunoglobulin. GBS develops shortly after an infection with the aforementioned pathogens. This is when the immune system develops an anti-mediated attack on the nerve sheath due to molecular mimicry between glycans expressed by the pathogen on their lipooligosaccharides and identical glycans present on nerve gangliosides, making antibodies the first immune cell to encounter the affected or target cells, nerves, and more specifically their myelin sheath.
So, how does the immune system respond more specifically? So far, we know that antibodies are a major component in the autoimmunity. So, which class of antibodies are we talking about? Well, it turns out that IgG antibodies are the ones that are behaving in the autoreactive manner. And more specifically, it is the IgG1 and IgG3 subclasses that are involved. So, it is this class that mistakes our own neural tissue with other microbial surface molecules. So, why does this happen? It turns out that there is immense similarity between the microbial surface molecule and GM1 and GD1A gangliosides. And it is this similarity that is causing the antibodies to recognize the neural tissue as foreign. And if you're wondering what gangliosides are, they're just glycans that sit on the extracellular space of neural tissue membranes and are used in extracellular communication, which is very critical. So this slide basically goes over the whole entire process, and so I'll go over it step by step. And basically,
it starts off with the antigen presenting cell, and normally the antigen is from the actual microbe, in many cases Campylobacter jejuni. However, the molecular mimic also exists on our neural tissue. So the APC will activate a T cell, which we will get into later on. Um, but mostly it will activate B cells, um, which like mature into plasma cells and secrete antibodies. And as we said before, it's the IgG antibodies that are recognizing the antigen, and which causes the problems. And so once it binds, it starts to bind complement, which leads to the formation of the membrane attack complex, which either leads to apoptosis or lysis of the neural cell. And you also get the attraction of macrophages as part of the inflammatory response. And basically, all this leads to either a conduction blockade or axonal injury, or maybe both.
Knowing all this, what do the cells look like under a microscope? In square B, we can see the difference between healthy myelin and abnormal myelin. And the healthy myelin is pointed to by the black arrow, and the unhealthy myelin is pointed to by a white arrow. And straight off, the biggest difference, as you can see, like by the darker color of the healthy myelin, this is because it is much more compact, as it should be, and the unhealthy myelin, which has already been subject to the MAC complex, the macrophages, it's already much more fragmented and much more degraded, essentially. And in square C, we can actually see the macrophages, and they're labeled by the letter M, as they're attacking the or congregating near the axon. And you can also see these macrophages in square E, but this time they're sort of at the node of Ranvier near the axon, which is another area where where they where they congregate, and they need to do this in order to demyelinate the axon. So, what about T cells? Do they have a role in any of this? Well, it turns out that the answer is pretty much yes, but there's still research being done, and their exact role is still sort of not fully understood. However, one study found that TFH2 and TFH17 were found in much higher concentrations in patients with GBS. So it is believed that these cells increase the autoreactive B cell response. So, what kind of symptoms does all this lead to? Some of these symptoms include overall weakness, partial paralysis, autonomic dysfunction, which has an entire list of symptoms on its own. But generally, we'll see muscle pain, reduced tendon reflexes, and in very very severe cases, we can see respiratory failure.
What research is left? There is still research to be done by completely blocking damage to the peripheral nerve. An ELISA can be used to determine the levels of self-recognizing antibody present in the periphery. If treatment is successful, there would be lower levels of antibody present in the periphery. Who does this affect? 10 to 20% of people diagnosed with GBS are still left with lingering difficulties after treatment, and that includes kids and adults. In a follow-up study of 34 children who were diagnosed with GBS, 65% still experienced paresthesia of the hands and feet, pain in the hands and feet, or had severe fatigue. 26% had suffered school deterioration, which here includes being held back or dropping out of school. 11% were unable to attend work full-time or school full-time. When asked on a questionnaire, it was discovered keeping attention, having depression, or being withdrawn were some of the issues that resulted after treatment. Although it was easier to regain neurological function, more psychosocial problems had followed. A separate study was done with 76 adults diagnosed with GBS. After treatment, some social difficulties had included changing occupations, which may have led to economic problems. There was also a reduction of social activities that the adults had participated in, and 62% had had impacts on their carers' lives. Some psychological effects included anxiety, depression, and extreme stress, more than the normal population had experienced. 84.2% still experienced constipation, and 82.9% had experienced urinary problems. Although more males are affected by GBS, after treatment, females had reported lower levels of functional independence, higher levels of depression, anxiety, and stress. Older patients were not able to care for themselves as independents. Although the adults had better motor recovery, they were not able to fully regain many neurological abilities. Who is funding the research? Two organizations that are taking the lead on GBS research are the World Health Organization and the Guillain-Barré Syndrome Chronic Inflammatory Demyelinating Polyneuropathy Foundation International. GBS CIPD have fundraisers that help raise money for grants, and those grants are given to the researchers for understanding GBS and CIPD. The World Health Organization supplies guidelines to reinforce healthcare systems. They also take the lead if there are new ways GBS can originate or become triggered. In the past, it had been speculated that the Zika virus was a trigger for GBS, so the World Health Organization had put measures in place to manage its treatment. Funding this research benefits the children and adults diagnosed with GBS. Research can lead to new treatments and preventive measures so GBS can be avoided. Information gained by researchers is also important for healthcare providers. As they are interacting with patients, they will be able to help them understand their situation and offer options for the patients post-treatment.